In the early 20th century, ships crossing Lake Michigan began reporting signals they could not trace. The messages appeared at regular intervals. They followed patterns, but no confirmed source was ever found, and the signals did not stop. Lake Michigan, like the other Great Lakes, stretches across distances that can feel closer to an inland sea than a lake. From certain points along its shoreline, the opposite side is not visible. Weather can form quickly, waves can build without warning, and for ships moving across its surface, navigation depends on more than what can be seen. By the early 20th century, vessels traveling these waters had begun to rely on radio communication. Signals were used to identify positions, guide routes, and maintain contact between ships and stations along the shore. A signal, once received, was expected to have a source: a lighthouse, a station, another vessel, something fixed, or something moving with purpose. And for the most part, the system worked as intended. Ships followed known paths, stations transmitted at expected intervals, and the lake, though vast, remained part of a network that could be mapped and understood. But over time, reports began to emerge that did not fit within that system. Signals were received that did not match any known source. As radio communication became more common on ships crossing Lake Michigan, operators spent long periods listening through headphones, monitoring the steady flow of signals moving across the air. Most of what they heard followed a pattern: short bursts of Morse code, identifiable call signs, messages transmitted at expected intervals from known stations along the shoreline or from other vessels moving across the water. The sounds were familiar, rhythmic, something that could be recognized even before it was fully understood. But among those transmissions, something else began to appear. At first, it was easy to dismiss: a signal that didn't match a known call sign, a sequence that seemed slightly out of place. Operators would pause, listen, and then continue with their work. Interference was not uncommon. Signals could overlap. Atmospheric conditions could distort transmissions, and equipment did not always produce a clear result. But the unfamiliar signals did not disappear. They returned, not continuously, but often enough to be noticed. They followed patterns that suggested intention, repeating sequences, measured timing, not random noise. Operators began writing them down. Short sequences of dots and dashes that did not correspond to any known station or vessel. In some cases, the signals appeared at the same time each day. In others, they emerged without a clear schedule, cutting through otherwise normal transmissions. When attempts were made to respond, there was no reply. The signal would continue for a time, then stop, leaving only the usual traffic of the lake behind it. At that stage, the signals were not treated as a problem. They were noted, considered, and often set aside. Something unusual, but not yet something that required an answer. As the months passed, the reports became more consistent. Operators on different vessels began noting the same kind of signal: short, deliberate sequences that did not match any known source along the lake. The details were similar. The timing was not always exact, but it followed a rhythm that felt intentional. A signal would appear during otherwise routine traffic. It would cut through the steady exchange of messages, distinct enough to be recognized even before it was fully written down. Those listening would pause, adjust their position, turned slightly toward the equipment, as if that might make the source clearer. The sound itself did not change. Clear, measured, repeated. On some ships, operators began keeping written logs of the sequences. Pages filled with dots and dashes that did not resolve into recognizable call signs. In some cases, different vessels recorded nearly identical patterns within the same period of time, even when they were not close to one another on the water. That detail began to stand out. If the signal had come from a fixed point, it might have been possible to trace. If it had come from a vessel, it might have moved along a predictable route. But the reports did not align with a single location. The signal did not behave like something anchored. It appeared. Wherever it was received, attempts were made to respond. Operators sent return signals using standard identification codes, waiting for acknowledgement. There was none. The transmission would continue for a time, then stop, leaving only the quiet hum of the equipment and the familiar rhythm of ordinary communication behind it. By this point, the signals were no longer dismissed as interference. They were still not fully understood, but they were recognized. Something present within the system, something repeating, and something that did not clearly belong to anything that could be found. As the signals continued to appear, efforts were made to understand where they might be coming from. Radio operators compared notes, logs were reviewed, and attempts were made to identify patterns that could point to a fixed location or a moving source. Some explanations focused on the nature of radio transmission itself. Signals can travel beyond their intended range. They can reflect off layers of the atmosphere. They can bend, overlap, and arrive in places that are not directly connected to where they began. Under certain conditions, a signal from far away can be received as if it were much closer. This possibility was considered. If the transmissions were coming from distant stations, distorted by atmospheric conditions, it might explain why they could not be easily traced. But that explanation did not fully account for the consistency of the patterns, the timing, the repetition, the structure of the sequences that suggested intention rather than distortion. Other possibilities were raised. An unidentified vessel operating without proper identification. A station transmitting outside of known records. Something present within the network, but not formally recognized as part of it. Yet no such source was confirmed. No ship reported responsibility. No station acknowledged the transmissions, and no location could be established where the signal began. Each explanation provided part of a framework, something that could be imagined, something that could be followed for a moment. But none of them held long enough to resolve the question. The signals could be heard, they could be recorded, but they could not be traced to anything that remained. Over time, the reports of the signals became less frequent, or perhaps they became less widely recorded. The systems used for communication continued to develop, technology improved, and the structure of radio networks became more organized. But the earlier accounts remained: notes written by operators, logs containing sequences that did not match any known source, and descriptions of transmissions that appeared, repeated, and then disappeared without explanation. Lake Michigan remains active. Ships still cross its surface. Navigation systems have changed, but the need to communicate across distance has not. signals continue to move through the air above the water. Most of them can be traced, identified, understood. But the earlier reports described something different. A pattern that could be heard but not located. A signal that repeated but did not respond. And a presence within a system that was otherwise mapped and known. No confirmed source was ever established. No final explanation closed the record. Only a series of transmissions, heard clearly and never traced back to where they began. That was tonight's story. You've been listening to The Midnight Box. Wherever you are, thank you for listening. Good night.